Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Bonjour.
Hello.
Oui, très bien.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, just tell me when to start. Should I just start with my introduction?
Well, let us confirm that everybody has connected successfully and that everybody is audible.
Okay.
We can hear you and see you just fine. Let's check with Marta. Marta, I can see you are with us. Can you say something, please?
Sorry, my microphone was muted. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm here. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
How about Eric?
Très bien.
Very well. That's perfect.
Okay, then I think we can start. The interpreters will switch their cameras off. Piotr, can you switch your camera off? Yeah, so you can start. I'm muting myself.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome, and to viewers. Today we'll be discussing and exploring a whole bunch of interrelated topics dealing with the ways in which human societies use animals for their own purposes in various contexts, but also how humans then narrate or forget to narrate the experiences of the animals they bend to their own needs and interests. So looking into approaches for reversing the writing and telling from anthropocentric perspectives, reversing the narrative so as to better comprehend the experience of the animals from their perspective. So we are joined today by Éric Baratay, who is a professor of history in the Faculty of Arts and Civilization, hope I got that correct, at Jean Moulin University in Lyon. Professor Baratay is a historian specializing in animal-human relations and a pioneer in the field of animal studies. He is the author of many, many books covering a range of subjects related to animals and the experiences of animals in different societal contexts, how they have been historically treated by humans, regarded or disregarded by humans, employed by humans, weaponized by humans. His books include Beasts of Burden, Animals in the Service of Man, and especially relevant to today's discussion, The Animal's Point of View, another version of history, and Beasts of the Trenches, Forgotten Experiences. And those titles in particular are especially relevant because we're also joined by visual artist, photographer, and filmmaker Marta Bogdańska, who in the role of artist, researcher, editor, bookmaker is the author of, this book, Shifters, which is an 850-page artist book published by the Foundation for Visual Arts in Krakow and Landskrona Photo. Is the result of multiple years that Marta spent researching, collating, and editing together archival material specifically related to the history of the use of animals by Western militaries, intelligence agencies, and police forces. So Western defense institutions from the late 19th century to the 1970s. Okay, that's the most I'm going to talk for the duration of this discussion. I'm going to start with you, Professor Baratay. So in your introduction to Shifters, and by the way, Professor wrote the introduction, you write that Marta joins other artists who, at the beginning of the 20th century, with their manner of painting, began to awaken us to the animal point of view. And there's a painting by one of the artists you reference, Otto Dill. It's a painting of a pair of lions in a cage at the zoo, and they're being stared at by two men and a woman wearing fancy clothing. But the painting's perspective is not looking in at the lions, but it's reversed. We are in the cage with the lions. The people are in the background looking at us. We are more lion than human. And actually the faces of the lions are painted with great and respectful detail, but the humans have no faces, blank, stripped of features, which makes sense because the lions are ignoring them. So my question for you to start off today is, there's a chapter in your book, Zoo, A History of Zoological Gardens in the West, entitled Artists and the Zoo. And I'm wondering if a perspective of being inside looking out from the animal point of view that Dill used, if that's common or is it an exception? Is something like that, would that have been a challenge to conventional depictions of caged animals across artistic mediums?
Alors, oui, c'était
Yes, indeed. It was an exception. At that time, when we wrote that book with a number of colleagues, it was around 1995, and we started to get interested in the history of animals, but what I would call the human history of animals, the way in which we humans think about and treat animals. In this book, at that time already, we already thought that we wanted to see what happened on the side of the animals, and my colleague delved deeply and looked and investigated a number of registers of different zoological gardens, among others registers of the Paris Zoological Garden. And this allowed us to calculate the mortality rate. And it turned out the mortality rate was very high at that time. So that was in the 19th century. The people in charge of the zoos, they admitted it easily. It was evident. It simply was like that. It was some side effect, some loss. And starting from the 20th century, the first the first critical remarks from the audience, from the society, we see in the archives that people would write letters around 900, and they simply complained about the way in which the animals were treated. During the 20th century, we saw around zoos at the same time this will to give more to animals, so give them more room, give them more closeness, more ability to play, but at the same time they would hide more and more the fatality rate. I mean, at that time, nowadays, no zoo would give us how frequently the animals die and how successful they are in breeding. This is a huge mistake, I believe, but it shows that there is a social problem really growing around zoos, and people, at least in Western Europe, but also in Northern America, are focused on how the animals are doing. This is really a topic in society. In 2018, I went to China, and in China, I heard speeches from academics, from officials, from the party, and those speeches showed me that China was only starting to become aware of the fact that they need to change their vision and their approach. They can do it because they are catching up, because they are following the very rich past connected to Buddhism, to Taoism, and this allows them to cast a more ecological glance, but it's only at the very beginning. So it's only burgeoning. This is all to say that we really felt this need to look from the side of animals at history. And it started in the 1990s, and I started really delving scientifically into this around 2000.
Okay, and Marta, in fact, Professor Baratay's history from the animal point of view, this was actually a sort of guiding concept for you, was it not? It was an inspiration as you were working on this book. That was something that, actually tell us about how you first came upon that concept and ways in which it guided you as you envisioned and then worked on this book.
Yes. Okay. So actually, the first ideas around this book or this project called Shifters came to me maybe 5 or 6 years ago. I don't remember exactly, because the first impulse or the first thing that happened was that actually I started coming across and then collecting articles in like mainstream Western media nowadays, like totally contemporary, that were talking about specific animals being arrested for espionage or being accused of some kind of being some kind of agent. And I found that really interesting. First, I was totally shocked because the first article I came across, I think it was still in Lebanon. I lived in Lebanon for more than 8 years. And I think I came across this article about dolphin being arrested in the Lebanese waters and kind of accused of maybe being a Mossad spy. And then I started gathering more and more of these articles. I made a collection, and actually it makes the first chapter of my book now, because I found something really interesting, which was also beyond just this anecdotal or interesting aspect of those stories. It was that first they would be published in local newspapers, so be it in Arabic or be it in Farsi, whatever language they were first published in, and then they were republished, like translated and republished into mainstream media in the West. And 99% of the time there was a certain mocking gesture, or like a little bit of making fun of those articles. Look, how can we arrest a pigeon in India for being a spy of Pakistan? You know, there was like this big deal actually a couple of years ago, where a pigeon flew from Pakistan to India and was allegedly arrested for being a spy. And it was like a big campaign and social media saying that he's the hero of Pakistan. Anyways, it all became like, it grows into different directions. But what I was interested in was that a lot of these articles in Western media, in English or French or German, they didn't really delve deep into the context. So some of them, but really not a lot, would mention something about Western military using animals, or CIA using animals for some kind of programs. And that kind of like triggered my first interest. And I remember that I had this title in my head suddenly, like Shifters. I didn't really think much at that time what was going to happen with all of that. But once I started researching the archival material, and I started looking into that actual history of the Western military wars, and especially the spy programs, like for example, the CIA that I just mentioned, I realized that this term, shifters, is actually a perfect term for this whole project, because it comes on one hand from the mythological world, where you have all these creatures that are shapeshifters, you know, and the gods, you know, the gods were also shapeshifters. They could change into animals, into different things, even immaterial things. But we also have it from the movie universe. So, and my first research was actually on the internet. So I was actually not really delving into this kind of classical archives, but I wanted to see how this kind of knowledge about animals in wars, or let's say animals in the war machine, are distributed on the internet. So I was doing this kind of associative research. I allowed my mind to just follow how people, you know, kind of combine images on the internet, and they were all very bad quality images, usually weak images, you know, copies of copies of copies. But at the beginning, I was really interested in that kind of gesture. So this is how it started, and that was the beginning of 2019.
So in terms of, I'm curious, actually, this will be a question for both of you. Maybe we'll start with Professor Baratay in terms of those sources, because of course the animals cannot write or narrate their own histories, which is kind of one of the central issues here. Professor Baratay, when you are working on one of your books, researching one of your books, and in general with the effort to tell history, animal history from the animal point of view, what is your approach to when you're, because, you know, if you're talking about, let's say, you know, bullfighting a century ago and you weren't actually there, and so you're dependent on human primary sources, you're dependent on, you know, well, anthropocentric documents. What is your approach in terms of trying to find the animal perspective, even if none of this material was actually written by the animals themselves?
Alors, effectivement, aucun animal n'a
Yes, it is true. No animal has written any record about history. This is the problem, but this is not the only example. If you look at the Middle Ages, No peasant wrote any document, and to write a history of peasants, you have to go through documents written by other people from other social classes, like notaries, like judges, etc. So you have more or less the same problem if you want to write the history of women in ancient time, in antiquity. At that time, the documents were written exclusively by men. The difference is, of course, bigger here because we speak of two different species. Nonetheless, we have a lot of documents, human documents, obviously, that speak of animals. There are differences of quality. There are some humans who say a lot of bad things about animals. So they cast a bad look on animals. During the First World War, I found an artilleryman who wrote his memoirs. He had gone through the war with horses, and he never mentions horses. He even uses an expression at some time saying, the cannons came galloping. So if someone suddenly comes from the moon, if we have the cannons galloping, it means that the cannons have legs and they are galloping, and the animal is gone completely. There's a complete eclipse of the animal. And we also have bad documents, but we also have very good documents where humans cast a look, a rather nice and kind look at animals and notice a lot of details. Those documents in themselves are not enough. To understand them, you very frequently have to read in between the lines. You have to delve into details, find one small detail that would have been missed if you were not interested in animals. And you need to intercross those documents with the current knowledge in terms of genetics, in terms of physiology, in terms of ethology and ecology. So you have to cross-reference both. It doesn't mean that you have to forget historical documents or to fully copy what we know about the ethology of dogs and copy it to the past. We cannot copy this because our dogs currently do not behave exactly like the dogs which lived in the 19th century or before. So when cross-referencing the two types of information, you have to be very careful. But if you get used to it, it turns out you find plenty of information, a richness of information. Without any doubt, perhaps it's only 20 or 30% of all that horses lived during the war, but it's still better than nothing. And this allows us to understand a lot of things. For instance, let's take the First World War. We can ask the question, why in 1914, at the beginning of the war, there were cavalry charges, very grouped, very close together, especially the English and the French were good at that, where in facing them, we have heavy artillery in the German army that would simply massacre horses and humans alike. Nowadays, this seems completely incredible. We would say, I mean, come on, they were stupid, those army men. Now, if we look at it from the perspective of a horse, we understand. When we have at the charge of a cavalry, we have horses, the one next to the other, horses would notice very easily the cannons firings, the cries, shouts, and the horses, had they not been close together, they would have been scared and they would have fled. If you want to charge with horses, at that time, you have to group them together very closely so that the first horses in a row, by also elevating a lot of dust, and there was a whole dust cloud that would hide what was happening, and also the noise of the galloping horses would simply muffle all the other noises of the battle. So the perspective of the animal is key to understand the perspective of the human. With those documents, we can do a lot. We can describe war, of course, but I also wrote biographies. I also wrote the history of the evolution of behavior of cats in the 19th and 20th century. It's a new book just published, and it is going to be translated into Polish. The same editor will also publish the book, the same as we had in Beasts of Trenches, etc. So you can do a lot of things with those documents. You have to work them like Marta is doing. Work with them in a very special way, perhaps not as a historian, but as an artist. And Marta is doing just that. She is bringing closer to us some things we could have not have seen if we had simply seen one picture after the other. So let me wrap up by saying that indeed we will have to go further than that. We will have to find documents that are not human. And we're starting to get those. For instance, archaeozoology. So archaeology specialized in animals, so animal bones. And thanks to those documents, we are now starting to learn a lot of things about animals that cannot be found in what humans wrote at that time. But we are going to have even more, and the biggest source of the 21st century is genetics. And it's DNA, genome research, all that connected to animals, and epigenetics. Epigenetics, I mean, every single individual, human or animal, has their own genome. The genome is like the keys of a keyboard, but every individual person, depending on the environment, is going to play a different tune. And certain keys will never be touched on this keyboard. And other keys are going to be played very frequently, depending on the environment. And this is an epigenome. This is something that depends on the circumstances and the surroundings of humans and animals. This means that we are going to learn step by step a lot about those animals using documents that are no longer anthropocentric, but that are simply animal remains. And we are going to go even one step further, because now we know that we have the sedimentary DNA. This means that when the bones are, we are under the impression that the bones are gone, there is only soil. In reality, the DNA remains in the soil. And we can, in that way, delve deeper into the soil and take out DNA of humans and animals and study them to know about diseases, what they ate, how they migrated between regions, etc., etc. And step by step, this type of document is going to bring us more and more information, and quite valuable information. In reality, therefore, if we want to do it, we can fully look from the perspective of the animal. I did it as a historian. We also have writers who do it. For instance, I recommend the biography of Floch, the biography of Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf, who was a great writer, she wrote a book about Floch in using the letters of the mistress of the dog. So this is a remarkable book. There are passages that are anthropocentric, but others, in other passages, we read exactly life from the perspective of the animal. The animal is traveling on train, and we read about how the dog perceives lights, or a walk in Rome. Rome is not described by sight, but it is described by what the dog feels in terms of smells. So This is a writing perspective. We have Marta doing it another way. And there are also painters who tried, for instance, Franz Marc, before 1914, who asked the question of how can we look at the world from the perspective of the animal. Those attempts made by artists are very, very important. That's why I loved Marta's book, because we come to the realization in history, at least for a few decades, that all those works by painters, artists, writers, photographers have prepared our society, Western society, to care deeper for animals. And the researchers, the scientists came only later. They only confirmed what the artists had started. So we see that artists played a really key role here.
Well then, so to go to you, Marta, as an artist, sort of an artist researcher, I guess in this case, but you are an artist, you're a visual artist, photographer, you're also a filmmaker. You decided to approach this delving into archives in search of photographs. That was it's not the only medium in the book, but specifically that's the main medium. And in doing so, I mentioned auto dill painting earlier, which is a canvas that can be hung on a wall in a museum and can be a painting that might be intended to be hung on a wall, let's say in a museum or gallery. The vast majority of images that you ended up selecting to be included in Shifters were never meant to necessarily be exhibited anywhere. Maybe they were, in some cases, it was a photojournalist to be reproduced in a newspaper, but a lot of these, they're in archives, but some of these, even if some are iconic, most of these maybe have not been seen, maybe by the person who put it in the archive, but that's it. And so as you are building this book and you are going into these archives to gather your material, and it's visual. So in terms of Professor Baratay talks about reading between the lines. So you're sort of reading between the visual lines or different graphic motifs and such. What was your relationship to this, I guess, vernacular material, I would say, as you built the book over the course of years?
Yes, indeed, the material is super diverse, I must say. And as I was telling you, I started with the internet research. So some of these images don't even belong to any official archives. I don't even know where they come from, because at some point we did a very long research into sources, and some of them we couldn't really trace at all. Some of them come from more, let's say, established archives like National Archives or War Archives, where I actually specifically looked for images related to animals or animals in wars and stuff like that. And as I was saying, when I started it in 2019, the beginning actually of 2019, that was the time when I actually started reading Professor Baratay books, and I also went back to some classics like Singer or Caldwell, and also all the animal rights movements, and I was following all these things. And then I also looked into the very modern, like ecological feminism or new materialism, or all these theories of Donna Haraway or Rossi Braidotti or Eduardo Kohn, who kind of look for the philosophy or anthropology that can kind of go beyond the Anthropocene and can look for new ways of our common life with, non-human animals. For example, I love this term in Donna Haraway's article, which is responsibility. It's like written with a hyphen, which kind of means that you have the responsibility towards the animal, but you also have responsibility. So you're able to respond, and the animal is as well able to respond. And I think it's a beautiful term that kind of also summarizes this kind of new era of how maybe we could build new relationships with animals. But coming back to the visual archives, of course, as an artist, I have this, I would say, a different approach, because I was a bit more free in how I could look at these images and all this huge material. I mean, we had like a maximum of pages, 850 at some point, and I still have more images. But from the beginning, when I was like kind of seeing how much there is, And there is a lot already on the internet, but it's not really critically approached. I think that's the point. I mean, it's somehow in our subconscious, like it is somewhere. Everyone heard about one or two animals from the war, like the famous bear Wojtek, you know, this is very famous in Poland. But for example, no one ever heard about Baśka, which I discovered at some point, which was another bear, a polar bear earlier in the 1919 that came with the Polish army from Siberia. So there's some of those stories function, and you know there are some journalists who dig out certain programs by CIA, and so it is scattered on the internet, but no one really kind of does a very reflective or critical research on that visual material. And for me, it was also clear from the beginning that I don't want to compose a 100 pages neat album with like beautiful reproductions of these photos, you know, very good quality. It was not, I didn't feel that this is how it should be approached from my perspective. I really wanted to keep that kind of image, like weak image correlation, because that's how I think most of this knowledge unfortunately still function. We see it as a, you know, as some scattered information, and there's a lot of that, and it's sometimes bad quality, sometimes it's sentimental and anecdotal. So I wanted the book, like it's really huge. I wanted these images to be bad quality. There is a theory by Ito Steyerl. She has this article that she wrote. It's called In the Defense of Weak Images. So these weak images are exactly what I was interested in at the beginning, where the images are copies of copies of copies, and we don't even know who's the original author anymore, but they still function. And can we actually build knowledge out of these images? Can we actually make them relevant? Can they actually tell us something? That was the first kind of impulse behind this this research and project. And then I added a more classical, but still I never visited any archive because it was pandemic. So I didn't even do this kind of classical, you know, sitting in the archive and go. So I don't know, I only managed to access things that are digitalized, which is also interesting. Maybe there's still much more there, you know, hidden. And what I found really interesting is that when you use this reiteration of images, when you allow them to flow kind of freely, and you don't necessarily kind of cut the repetitions out, you know, I didn't want to use one image of that, one image of that, and one image of that, and that's it. I actually wanted them to kind of repeat themselves, to show how much work and emotional work and sacrifice and pain animals had to endure for humans. And this is a very short period of time. I'm not even talking about things that happened before or after, or in other disciplines or areas of how humans use animals. So I don't know, I had this feeling that in this reiteration of images, that the actual point of view of the animal starts coming out. You know, maybe you don't see it in one image, you know, you could kind of miss it, because then you maybe focus on the sentimental value of the photo of the soldier smiling to this donkey or to this cat, you know, this mascot. But when you see like 50 of them, kind of similar mascots in the army, you start realizing how much of emotional work animals start doing for these soldiers, and how this is completely overlooked, and how we don't have it in our consciousness at all. Like we don't really think about it usually on a normal basis, you know, on a daily basis. So I hope this is something that comes out of this book, you know, that through, there's this beautiful quote from Eduardo Kohn, actually, this anthropologist who tries to write anthropology not only from human perspective. He writes exactly this. He says, we are looking at animals, and the animals are looking back at us. So what are these animals actually seeing, you know? And I think when you look at the images in this book, you start seeing that these animals are not a passive, object. They are also agents. They are creators of this destiny. They are cohabitants of history. So yeah, I hope that answers your question somehow.
Yeah, definitely. That's interesting, because actually, Professor Baratay, in your introduction, you make mention to the animals in the images looking for clues from their human handlers to try and figure out what exactly is going on in a specific situation, trying to read their humans and being reliant on their humans for information about, you know, the animals are not aware of geopolitical context or the military strategy of a famous general, and so trying to interpret their humans. And so if we look at the eyes of the animals looking at their humans, what can we learn? I have a question about animal histories, but specifically stories of famous animals and the way they're written about when you do happen upon a piece that's a little bit longer, that has a little bit more information about a specific animal. And I'll start with you, Professor Baratay. So the reason I'm here is because I wrote a number of the texts for the book, actually similar to how you're talking about collaboration across disciplines. Marta and I decided, I'm a poet, and Marta and I decided to work together, and that I would try a little bit more of a poetic or literary approach to the subjects that the book focuses on. And in the course of researching the animals and the subjects that I ended up writing about, the vast majority of texts on animals, on specific animals, they were anecdotal. They rarely, if ever, was there any reflection on ethics or on, getting past sort of the euphemisms and getting past the charming details. And that jumped out to me was the charming details. You mentioned Marta Bogdańska, the polar bear, who was a mascot for a Polish regiment during the First World War. And there is the story about Bogdańska saluting to the Polish head of state military leader Józef Piłsudski in 1919 in a military parade in Warsaw, things like that. Oh, isn't it cute that the bear saluted to the general? Or Jackie the baboon, who has an incredibly tragic history, a baboon from South Africa in the trenches of the Western Front, is using human cutlery to eat military issued rations. And so, Professor Baratay, I'm wondering, as you're looking to go deeper and to access the animal perspective and unlock facts, the facts that are just left out of these accounts, how do you deal with that element of people sort of this urge to get the charming details about stories that actually are really not charming at all, but pretty tragic when you look past the medals that the animal was given?
Yes, absolutely. You're right. The situation was not at all easy for the animals. It wasn't either easy for humans at that time, but I found a lot of information, both from the West, also from the German side, Austrian, English, or Australian even, of people who felt that they were sharing the same fate as animals. They said they are our companions in misery. And this is a very strong expression. Those lives were difficult indeed. Marta mentioned dogs or other animals accused of being spies, but it's very important and interesting to see that already during the First World War, we have dogs who are used to go through the enemy lines. Whether it's English, French going to Germany or the other way around, but those dogs are used to send messages. They carry messages. And what is very interesting is that those dogs very frequently were successful in going through enemy lines. Why? Because the soldiers in the trenches, or at least a lot of them, developed a kind of interest in those animals. They were interested in those dogs. And we have a lot of people writing that those animals could freely circulate between one camp and the other, going from the French to the German, to the English. They were going everywhere. And this allowed them to use dogs simply freely crossing enemy lines without the soldiers minding, thinking this is just a stray dog going to feast with the Germans and then going back home. But there were also dogs who were fully innocent. They were no spies, of course, in inverted brackets, but they simply were doing that. They were looking for food, but there were really surprising phenomena. I remember a text written by an English doctor who wrote that in one of the trench where he is, there is a cat sitting like on the in the upper part of the trench, simply, you know, licking himself, so cleaning himself. And the Germans are not aiming at this cat. They are not shooting the cat, although the cat is fully visible. And the physician had the reflection that if I were simply to raise my head even 1/3 above the limit, I would have simply a bullet in my head right away. So the cats and the dogs were tolerated because they would comfort the humans, and they brought a lot of comfort. And in that way, there was a lot of interaction between humans and animals. We also read of stories of horses or donkeys that were able to detect the artillery noises. So the soldiers were looking closely at the horses and their ears, and on the French side, when the French missiles were going above their heads, the horses could hear them even before they would fall down. The horses knew that they would not fall on them, and they would not mind, they would not budge. But when they heard some missiles that would, the German missiles, that would fall on them, they were suddenly panicked. And the soldiers could read the signs because the soldiers had difficulties telling the difference between their own artillery shooting and the enemy missiles incoming. They could not process the information from the sound as quickly as the horses. And some soldiers hear, and we also hear of horses that would simply look for refuge in the trenches, and then humans would follow because they understand that the horses knew that they were in trouble or about to get in trouble. So at the same time, we have a lot of harshness, a lot of pain, difficult emotions, but we also have this camaraderie between humans and animals. And this makes this war a very special time. It doesn't mean that everyone was saint or Saint Francis. There were, of course, soldiers shooting animals for the sheer pleasure of killing them. But we also have cases where, in the end of the day, there was some kind of friendship, a mutual friendship, where animals were on both sides, in both camps. And we see that they brought a lot of psychological comfort. Having a dog next to you, having a cat, this was something that allowed the soldier to forget about war, to think about the civil life, the life from before, the life that was left behind, and also to hope. It allowed them to hope to regain that kind of normal life. So the animals were very important. They were not only mascots. You spoke of mascots like the bear, but there were also other animals, anonymous animals that were incredibly important for the soldiers.
How do you feel, Professor Baratay, about that, the sacrificial element of an animal that didn't volunteer to join the military, and whether it's a horse or a dog, is suddenly there in the trenches, giving comfort? I had the feeling, looking through a lot of material, I thought if I was the parent of this young soldier, this 20-year-old in the trenches in the First World War, and if that animal, if that dog, if Stubby the dog or some animal gave my son even a small measure of comfort, I am immeasurably grateful to that animal, and I feel grateful that the animal was there with my child. But nobody asked the animal to be there. And so how do you feel when you're going through the material? These animals are, from picking up the sounds of incoming shells, running up and down the trench, they're going to no man's land and finding stranded, injured soldiers and barking to bring medics. How do you feel about the fact that, just that the animals had no choice in being in that situation to be used to help in some way?
Alors, évidemment, on ne leur a
Yes,
pas
obviously, no one asked them what they thought, but there are other soldiers as well who were not asked what they thought. For a long time, historians now have shown it, but for a long time, we believed that, and even some movies are showing it, that there was a boost of, happiness. And yes, the war is here. We're going to crush them. It's going to last 50 days and we're going to be happy. But historians basically proved that a lot of soldiers were forced to go. They were resigned, far from unhappy. They had a duty to do. It's the difference that compared to animals, but this difference is not that huge. When I read this scene about a soldier coming with, a bowl of soup for everyone, and he comes to the canteen. The canteen, there is a cook, and this is basically the kitchen, a mobile kitchen that is transported by horses. And he says, we are companions of misery, because he looks at the animal that was not asked its opinion, but the soldier himself seems he is here willy-nilly. I mean, he didn't ask to come. And the next day he comes back to the field kitchen to fill his bowl, and the donkey or the horse, I don't remember, is dead. I mean, the animal is dead with the bowels coming outside from its body, and the soldier is shocked, because this is he is thinking this is the, I don't know if this soldier survived, but he is imagining that it is exactly what is going to happen to himself and his human companions. Not all soldiers have this, but a lot of them have this idea of being united. No one asked us whether we want to participate in a war. It's even stronger when we speak of animals. The most important point being that no one cared about the animal point of view or the needs of the animals. When horses were put together to draw a cannon, no one would care whether one horse liked the other. And now we know that some horses cannot work together when they then dislike each other. One can not work at all and let the other do all the work. And it's the same for dogs. We had those Belgian military dogs because the Belgians felt it a good idea to have dogs also draw heavy artillery cannons. And the soldiers who came up with this idea knew that they would have to really mind the dogs. But they came from the bourgeoisie that had only started to care for dogs. But the peasants who would work around the dogs came from the world of the workers, or the peasants. Well, they had no relationship to dogs. They had a very distant relationship, even full of violence, and they simply did not care whether two dogs liked or disliked each other, whether they needed to stop, to have a break, to eat, to drink. They totally disregarded the needs of the animals. And finally, what was the most difficult for those animals, it was probably that the fact that they could not make the humans understand what they wanted. In the summer of 1914, a lot of horses died, not only during combat. No, it isn't during a battle. They simply die in the back. Now we know why. Because the soldiers did not think about taking care of those horses. They had to get something to eat, something to drink, or at least give them water. At that time, the summer of 1914, we have a war that goes very fast. Every group of soldiers is afraid of falling into a trap of the enemy and get massacred. So you have to be able to flee, to react very quickly to what is happening. So we don't mind the animals. We don't have time. We don't mind the horses. And now we know that the horses, when they want to drink, when they are dehydrated, they don't feel it so clearly as we humans do. They get dehydrated, they would need to drink, but there is not enough signals for the soldiers at that time to notice that something was wrong. And this leads obviously to the fact that we have horses that are dehydrated and die.
This is it's really interesting because one of the, I think possibly the longest of the 14 chapters in the book, Marta, is about the CIA Animal Partners Program, which was a program during the Cold War where the United States Central Intelligence Agency was looking into ways to use animals. I mean, basically a thread through the use of animals is their some superior sensorial capability. Or as Professor Baratay says, that and the ability to be seen but not seen and just dismissed, ignored, like the animals in the trenches. And so, Marta, I have a question for you, because in terms of animal partners, actually, sorry, no, just the one note I wanted to say is that there's one feasibility report I read that was declassified by the CIA. It was about using pigeons as photographers. So in other words, strapping a pigeon with a small camera that has an automatic shutter release and sending the pigeon, let's say, to fly over, if you're the Americans, you're the CIA, you're sending the pigeon over a submarine base in Leningrad. And you basically use math, like the Pythagoras theorem or something, to figure out when the pigeon will be right over the area that you want to take a photograph of and have the shutter release go off. Anyway, in this feasibility report, there's a tremendous amount of detail about how to take care of the pigeons. So in some ways, this is the opposite of not knowing when to hydrate a horse. There are details about taking care of the coop, how to clean it. There's even information about pet shops across America, where to get like the best seed for the pigeons, like a specific pet shop in Wisconsin. But then there's this element actually where it's not about love of the animal, it's not about taking care of a cherished pet, but taking care of radar equipment, really, taking care of technology. But that's now we're in the 60s and the 70s in the Cold War. Marta, can you talk about animal partners at greater length? Because there were other things that came to mind when the professor was talking. For example, there were ravens that would be sent up to the windows of like diplomatic outposts with a microphone disguised as a piece of slate and dropped on a windowsill made of slate, so it was camouflaged. The people in the office would look, it's a raven, they would ignore it, and then there was a listening device on the windowsill. So anyway, there's so much in Animal Partners. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yes, actually, that was a really interesting story, because when I was already working on my second, oh my God, I have to mention something. In the last 20 minutes, I have a fly on my, and I'm sure it's listening. It's like, it's really here with us on my computer, you know, just walking around, strolling around and sitting on the camera. It's amazing. I'm just like, it's just perfect situation for this talk.
Don't say anything confidential.
Yeah, sure.
No state secrets.
No. I was working on my second dummy, and in September 2019, CIA actually suddenly decided to declassify a lot of its documents from this program called Animal Partners, which is actually a very hypocritical name, as we just discussed, because animals didn't sign any contracts, they didn't agree to anything, you know, in relation to collaborating with CIA. So naming this, code naming this program Animal Partners was very at least weird. So I was super lucky. I mean, there's not so many images, so I couldn't really, and of course I knew about a lot of these programs already before, because some journalists managed to like dig into something and find out about all these different spy programs or military programs that were connected to CIA. But still, it was like a gift happening in the middle of my work. So I managed to, as you said, look into some of those memos and reports and some ideas what some agents of CIA wanted to do with the animals. And there were lots of programs. I mean, not only by the CIA, but like if you want to just focus on CIA. So for example, there was this horrible program called Acoustic Kitty. Again, they always gave this really sweet, funny names to these programs, like Acoustic Kitty. What could it be? Yeah, well, it was actually a walking device that could record conversations. So basically, a cat was dissected in a surgery and like inserted with a super microphone into its ear, and with like some antenna and wires in its body, and then sewed back up, and then it was supposed to be put into a, I don't know, let's say Russian embassy or Soviet Union embassy at the time, because it was in the 50s, 60s, so 1950s, 1960s, Acoustic Kitty was happening. And what was interesting is that they say this program cost 20 million at that time. So it was a huge amount of money. And this is not 100% confirmed. There's a lot of this kind of urban legends in these programs, is that the cat that was actually finally prepared for this mission with this like a microphone in its ear and the antenna in its tail, it couldn't be just put next to the embassy because it would be too suspicious. So they had to kind of let the cat out somewhere around the embassy. And supposedly, as one of the experts who worked on this program, told to one of the newspapers, when the cat was let out, it was ran by a taxi immediately. So like the whole program got cancelled because the cat was gone and nothing ever happened. But there was lots of other programs. But what I wanted to say, like more generally, I think it's really interesting how we study the animal world and how we study all these capacities and skills of animals. But I don't know, maybe not 100%, but like 80% of the time, it's because we want to use it, like we want to use the skills of animals. It's not because we want to communicate better with animals. It's something that you mentioned, and Professor Baratay, I think, also mentioned already, that we want those skills to be useful for us. And that's why we only record in our history the animals who actually agree to collaborate with people. And I really found fascinating in your book, The Beasts of Trenches, for example, those small moments when you write about the resistance of animals. And this is something I'm super interested in, like when animals refuse to collaborate or when animals try to resist humans. You write this small chapter how they run away or they even die. That's an ultimate form of refusal, like when they die and they don't want to do anything for us anymore. And this is, I think, something that I'm going to work on in my next next chapter of this project. So I think this is important to mention, that we are not really putting the scientific knowledge into actually getting to know animals just because we want to be better with them. We want to communicate better, we want to collaborate better, or we want to cohabitate better. We do it for our interests. And I think it's this horrible heritage of this Cartesian philosophy that we are still in, that kind of, and also the biblical kind of theory where human being is on this, top of this hierarchy and has all this world for its disposal, while, and also Cartesians who thought that animals are just biological machines. So when you say that CIA was taking care of those ravens as of a good gear, you have to take care of your gear. I feel it's like so connected to exactly this, to Descartes saying that, okay, animal is just a biological machine. So, okay, we have to take care of it, but as much as we take care of a machine. That's one thing. And I also wanted to mention that for me, what was really important also in this book was to to kind of de-metaphorize. I don't know how to say it in English. Is there a word like that? Kind of, because we think about animals in metaphors and we use them a lot as metaphors for everything that we humans do. You know, we have so many examples in language of how we you know, put metaphors on animals. So for me, it's also very important what always Professor Baratay mentions in his work is that we have to go back to this feeling body of the animal, you know, like the body that experiences, feels, dies, is hungry, is unhappy, you know, all these things. And not to look at the animal as a metaphor again, you know, because we do it so well. We always just do, you know, look at it as a metaphor. And I think also one last thing is that I think this I have always in my head, I wrote my thesis about Foucault, by the way, so always in the back of my head is that this biopolitics that Foucault kind of coined as a term for humans, but I think it perfectly, or maybe even better fits to animals when we are actually governing the bodies of animals to the extent that the whole survival of some species is only dependent on us, on humans. And as I remember in your book, the point of vue d'animal, you say about this whole species of cows that were just bred for the specific like shape of their body that would fit in a triangle, or I don't remember exactly how it was, but then it was discovered that it's not really useful. So they allowed the whole species to die out, you know, the whole cow breed was just like discarded. So this is like biopolitics taken to the extreme, I feel. So this was another kind of topic in the back of my head when I was doing this project. And one last thing is that for me also how I try to avoid all these problems that we were talking about with, you know, not having enough documents, you know, being human, that we cannot escape our own perspective. I also work with sound because this project has also other components, not only book. So what I do is I try to incorporate, for example, participatory work with sound. So I invite people to create sound pieces and think how we can try to express or understand animals. We take like they choose an image from my archive, you know, an archival photo, and then they create a short sound piece for this. It can be very abstract. Sometimes they use some kind of narrative, but lots of times it's really very creative and quite abstract and mixes a lot of different sounds. And I find it super interesting because I feel that sound can maybe somehow also allow us to access a different perspective on how to look and talk about animal experience, maybe.
And actually, that's something that I probably should have said in my introduction an hour ago, is that in fact, there is indeed an overarching Shifters project of which this artist book is one component. Shifters is also being exhibited, or was exhibited. Yeah, this year's Krakow Photography Festival, and then we'll be moving to Warsaw as an installation of which the book is one element. So Marta mentioned there are sort of traps of talking about animal histories using metaphorical language, using sort of anthropomorphic imagery. It's very easy to do, actually. And so I'm wondering, Professor Baratay, as you're writing, have you found over the decades that there are whole sets of words or verbs or euphemisms that it's very, very easy for one to end up using when writing about animals that are in fact a disservice to the animals and a disservice actually to accuracy, because they don't in fact accurately reflect the situation at the level of this is what actually happened. So when you're writing, are you ever even now aware of sort of thinking very carefully about, wait a minute, is that actually the word that we should use? Is this more accurate, or does this actually kind of conceal the actual felt truth, what the animal felt?
The issue of language is absolutely crucial. Depending on how we speak, We can skip, or we can even hide a significant part of the animal life. Metaphors that you mentioned were very numerous. Why? Because we, in terms of religious life, philosophy, or even science, there was always an opposition between what was human and animal. Animal here in the large scope, without a distinction of species. So the human, humanity, animal, and animality. Animals were the other side of the mirror. We see it very well in Middle Ages Christianism until the 17th century. Animals were used to show what should not be done. This is the other side of the spectrum and the counterbalance. Words were used that were not adapted. There is the fact that we are humans. We are guilty of a lot of anthropomorphism, so we have basically copied our vision of the world to the animals. When I read the documents, it's very interesting from a linguistic point of view, and I approach it from the animal point of view. This was meant to avoid what you mentioned. I was rewriting 4, 5, 10 times the same sentence because I would come back naturally to the human point of view. So I had to start from scratch once again to put the animals in the forefront and the humans in the back. I really put a lot of work in it. Now it has become a habit. It's not that difficult. And I had to put less effort for the beasts of the trenches. Well, animal biographies are now being translated into English, but not into Polish. So the animal biographies is a work during which I wrote the biography of some 10 animals. And I tried to work on the writing style, among others, to trace the corrida of Islero. Islero is the most famous bull that killed Manolet, a very well-known torero. And we have 12 pictures, that's all, where we see Islero, the bull, fighting a corrida. And using those 12 pictures and about all the knowledge that we know about bullfighting and ethology of cattle and behavior of bulls, we can understand what the animal goes through. And I tried to adapt my writing style so that it obviously remains a human work. We agree, yes, it is human work. But we are trying to put forward in this style of writing the animal characteristics and not to project our traits on the animals. So I tried to go slightly further with the most recent book about cats. And in this book, I even invented words and invented expressions. For instance, I don't know how it will work in translation. Palpate smelling. So it's about showing that for a cat to feel a smell means that you have to basically widen your nose or sink your claws into something as a verb for the cat. So I wanted to show that it is not an entity, a kind of creature that is devoid of emotions. No, I wanted to show both the physical presence of humans with their emotions, because we humans, we react both with our heads and our bodies. This is the same situation. I invented words, but I also invented expressions. And I was inspired by old literary work. For instance, the literature from Assyria from a few thousand years before Christ, and also I also used old French novels where there are expressions that are now completely archaic. For instance, throw your legs. Throw your legs in French used to mean walk. And so our vision of walking was far more body-centered, more integral, more holistic. And Marta, I agree with you. When you speak of Cartesianism, we simply limited ourselves to what is cerebral, what is brain-focused. And now using words and expressions, I showed that we could expand this. We could describe a situation from the point of view of the animal. This is the human language, obviously, but we are going one step closer to the animal. One other example, the expression ronron, ronronner, which means basically purr, so purring. We have a very recent expression in French, ronron, ronronner, and it comes from the 19th century. So the way to describe how the cat purrs. Before that, purring was described as a mechanical art of weaving wool, and only in the 19th century, when people started to get interested in cats as a pet, they noticed the purring, they became closer to the purring activity, and the cat also came closer to the humans and started purring more to attract humans. So this very recent invention of two words to describe purring, and I think they were invented by Honoré de Balzac, and this gave me the idea to also invent words. So verbs and nouns that allow us to better understand that an animal lives more in a body, but also has emotions, alive, a lot of feelings. Coming to an end, of course, this is human literature. And obviously, this remains in the human sphere of interest, but it is an additional attempt to come closer to animals. In a way, an artist, a painter, a photographer would do. So I tried to use my writing skills to escape from what you mentioned, a too human language. If the language is too human, if the expressions are too human, we are going to miss some traits of the animals we want to describe.
This so much reminds me of Donna Haraway when she talks about, I don't know if you know this term, tentacular thinking, you know? Have you heard that term? It's that the thinking doesn't happen only through the mind. It could be like the octopus, what it does, it thinks through its tentacle, how do you call them? Tentacles? Stefan, help me. How do you call them?
Yeah, this is tentacles. Octopus
yeah,
has
tentacle.
8.
Yeah, so you can, so thinking through your fingers, through your tentacles, through all these different things that we use, you know, and I love this tentacular thinking. Sorry, just a small note, because it really reminded me of this, because what Donna Haraway does is exactly this. She also built her new philosophy, this kind of post-anthropocentric philosophy on reinventing words and creating new language that kind of helps us to go beyond thinking only as humans.
So this is really interesting because, Professor Baratay, you're actually constructing words, building a vocabulary to better capture, let's say, the sensory experiences of an animal. Marta, as you're going into the archives, in some ways you're I want to say that you're both sort of breaking rules, but I mean that in a good way, that you're trying to find a way not to be limited by the rules. And Marta, you kind of plunge into archives in a way that I could imagine were if it had not been the pandemic and you were actually going into physical archives, you would have made the archivists very, very nervous, because I can imagine you running around the archive, papers up in the air, this sort of cyclone of curiosity, breaking all the rules, literally, but also figuratively. You use these archives in a very unique way. And Professor Baratay alluded to this earlier. Your approach in general is quite, I would say, radically enlightened. And so can you talk a little bit about how you threw yourself into these archives? I think the word you use in the books afterward is, so you like embraced profusion, cloud busting, which doesn't mean you just threw things randomly, because the juxtapositions are very specific. But how is your approach in just saying, I'm not going to be held back by anything, I'm just going to be guided by my curiosity and my artistic instinct and intuition?
Actually, yeah, it happened a little bit like that. And as I said at the beginning, I think the first step towards it that kind of allowed me to stay free was this internet research, where I allowed the kind of free flow of images to enter, like to go through my screen, and I could just like follow it and see what kind of catches my attention. I mean, this is the privilege of being an artist in this situation. Of course, I'm using certain theories and I have them in the back of my mind, but the freedom that I have as a visual artist is that I can actually then combine them and put them together in the way I like. But also it was a long process, because as I said, I had 2 dummies before this actual final book was published. And I also, you know, went to people, I discussed it with people, I showed my ideas. So they gave me some feedback, and then I realized, like, also while reading, especially Professor Baratay, I mean, I realized how they can be kind of built into chapters. And then there were those specific little stories that kind of don't exactly fit 100%, let's say, in the history. If I was a scientist, I wouldn't be able to use them, like the high diving horses, for example, the story that you finally wrote about. But because this story is about something completely different, but I think, or the Muybridge story, you know, which kind of for me fits into this kind of biopolitics of the animal body, but it's also not exactly related to war or the military programs, but it kind of gives a different dynamic and different maybe level of thinking, and I think opens up. And as an artist, I can do that. I can combine these extra things that, in my opinion, somehow fit in this specific place. So like the high diving horses, which was an entertainment for a long time, actually, from the beginning of the 20th century until the 1970s, 80s, and even until 2000, there was one last horse that you would do that still. It was a kind of entertainment that happened in the US parks, like this entertainment parks, where horses with like riders on them would jump from a platform into a tank filled with water. And a lot of those riders were women, actually, probably because they were lighter. I don't know, but it was never explained. And this continued for a long time. And I juxtaposed this story with a story that actually is beautifully explained in your book, The Beast of Trenches, where when horses were transported on ships through the Atlantic, especially in the First World War, what kind of experiences they had when they were lifted in the air and then packed on those, you know, on those ships. So I kind of juxtaposed this. The chapter is called The Flying Horse, and I'm kind of trying in this visual way to show what kind of horror and terror the horse actually could experience in this moment. Because at least from what I learned is that horses hate being like suspended in the air. So for them, it must have been quite a terrific, horrible experience. So, oh shit, I lost my thought. What was the question was about the cloud busting and the freedom. So yeah, I mean, I think maybe also another reason for me being able to stay so free in this project was that I never really worked with archives before. So I didn't have that classical archival training. And even as an artist, I only did once a project with like family archives some time ago in Lebanon, but I never really researched archives. I never really did all the stuff that people do with, like, you go to a physical place, you fill all those papers, you ask for this and that. This is what I actually don't like. I don't like being concise, that I have to know. I don't know from the beginning what I'm looking for, not always. So this kind of freedom was amazing. And maybe this no experience before allowed me to be like that somehow. I don't know.
So, okay, because you mentioned that artistic freedom that you have as an artist. In the text I wrote for this book, I was coming at it more as a poet, trying to distill some sort of essential element. And one thing I was very much aware of was that I was able to phrase things in ways that if I was a journalist, my editor would probably not allow me to, but ways that actually by phrasing something more subjectively, I felt came closer to the truth than the bland objective descriptions which can sometimes whitewash what actually happened and how it happened. A question for you, Professor Baratay, is it's wonderful to hear you. It's actually really inspiring to hear you talk about your evident respect for what literature is capable of in terms of even going further than some scientific or research fields in terms of getting at some essential truth. I'm curious about you as when you're working as a historian, as an academic and a researcher, but with this, it's very clear you have a literary spirit. How much freedom, like the freedom that Marta was describing as a visual artist, how much freedom do you allow yourself to maybe be a little bit more, I'll put subjective in quotation marks, but to go a little bit beyond what maybe strict objective research allows?
Tout à fait. Et dans le dernier livre sur les chats, j'ai essayé de faire ça justement, de lier.
This is exactly what I tried to do in my most recent book about cats, to link scientific language, scientific discourse, using other means from art, among others, to express my thought. I mentioned inventing words, but also another idea I had after my visit in China in 2018, I started reading Chinese literature, and I had this idea that in China, the signs, the Chinese signs, ideograms, depending on how they are written, give an additional emotion, give a surplus of meaning, not only the meaning of the word. So I tried to do exactly that in my most recent book. I used different characters, for instance, to describe a jumping cat or a high jumping cat, leaping cat. I use the word leap, bondir, but with sparse characters getting bigger and bigger. The letters would go bigger and bigger. That suggests to the reader that there is a leap going on. Or when, for instance, I write that an animal is lurking, the word lurking is written alternating lower and higher case letters to see that the animal is lurking, hiding behind the furniture, trying to hide itself. So I think that art and artists are very important because they force us to think differently. It doesn't mean that my work is not scientific. I keep all the scientific discipline that is required of me as a scientist. But there are artistic choices to be done. I focused on the writing style, letters, but we can do more. We can express more. And this is clearly visible in Marta's book. the way in which she accumulates pictures, how she groups them, gives us an additional message that could not be given otherwise. Whether you're a painter, you're a photographer, you're a writer, you have a certain freedom, and this is a precious freedom. I must admit that, well, my book came out in February in French, and the reception was mixed. Some people liked it very much. They liked the fact that there were some words invented, that the letters had different size to show how the animals move. But other people criticized these means. They said it was completely devoid of any special interest. So this is just the beginning. And when I wrote an animal point of view, people told me it's impossible to present the animal point of view. And now in France, after all the hard work we've put in, after all my work, and I also work with people who are into genetics or into literature. I have a lot of friends from the literary world. Now this is getting far more accepted. So writers show us very interesting things. We have a colleague who is a writer who is going to write an article about poetry by showing us how French poets from the beginning of the century, the 20th century, used rhyme, and how rhyme could be used to better understand how animals move. In other words, already at that time, 100 years before me, they had the idea that I very modestly and timidly put into my book about cats. Artists enjoy a certain freedom. This is not necessarily what I think, but for a lot of people, art is nothing serious. It's nothing serious. Like we have a writer who writes something that is disorderly, a photographer groups pictures in a way that seems chaotic. This is not important. What is important is philosophy, science, theology, and there are serious people. So there's a lot of censorship going on. And there is far less censorship aimed at artists. And thanks to that, thanks to this freedom, Donna Haraway that you mentioned, and whom I enjoy a lot, is a philosopher who not only reflects on certain concepts, but is really attached to observing what animals do, and also works on the linguistic level. So the input of artists is absolutely crucial. This means obviously that we have to go one step back, where in the 17th and 18th century, we separated completely, we severed science from arts. This wasn't true before, but starting from the 17th century, they wanted to make a difference. Serious science on the one hand, and entertainment and, you know, those light-spirited artists on the other. So when Franz Marc paints before 1914 about how my dog perceives the world, this is a beautiful painting. It depicts his dog, and Franz Marc, we know what he thought because he wrote a lot, but he thinks I cannot show a landscape the way I see it. No, I have to show the landscape the way my dog sees it. He starts with a reflection and he draws a landscape that is very geometrical, very colorful. Obviously, most probably, dogs don't see the world the way he has shown it, but there is some intuition in this painting. Another painting is about a roe deer in a forest, and he thinks I cannot depict the animal the way I see it, but I have to depict it the way the deer sees itself. It's fully abstract. We humans do not know where the deer is. Most probably, deers don't see the world in which Franz Marc has drawn it, but we see what he focused on. And then, surprise, Franz Marc does that in around 1910, and then dies during the war at the Battle of Verdun in 1916 on the German side. But 20 years later comes a biologist, Jacob von Beeckskühl, who is a German and writes the book Human World, Animal World, where he shows us that every species perceives the world in another way. In this book, there is a double page where you have 4 pictures, 4 drawings, let's say, that show us. This is a village street. This is how a human sees the village street. This is how a fly perceives the same street. So it's blurred. And this is how a mollusk would see it. So there is every chance that he was wrong, that he didn't have the means of knowing how shellfish was perceiving streets. So most probably this wasn't true, but the idea is there. Shellfish perceive world differently than flies, and us. The landscape that is drawn from this German man and perceived from a mollusk is very similar to what Franz Marc painted 20 years before. In other words, this shows us that both artists, I mean, you mentioned artists that put the spectator, the viewer inside of the cage with the lions and the audience is outside. Well, here we see that those 2 artists, but also those writers, started to make people think and also gave food for thought to scientists. Simple example now to wrap up. Stanley Cohen, an American etiologist, wrote a book, How to Speak Dog. This is one of the rare etiologists who dared to admit that he was influenced by what he read when he was a child. And he wrote about Lassie, the dog. I don't know if you know this, but this was a hit, a really blockbuster. He wanted to study etiology and the behavior of dogs, not to say that all dogs behave like Lassie. Lassie is very much anthropomorphized, but he said perhaps that dogs have some abilities we can see, we don't want to see, we're unable to see. So Lassie gave him this idea to look at dogs differently. And this is one example how art can stimulate science. This is even more interesting because we have very little etiologists that are going to admit to being inspired by something, but we see that art is preparing the foundation for something else, because art is not serious, and if it is not serious, it is not criticized or censored so much as academic texts. The academicians I work with tell me that when they send an article to a scientific review, there are things they cannot say. It is censored. They love the work that we are doing together by publishing a book, because in the book there is no censorship. They can really express themselves fully, or at least more freely than in the academic world, where the academic canon is very, very strict and rigid. And if they don't follow the canon, their article is going to be refused. So they gain a certain freedom and they become aware of the fact that this freedom allows them to speak differently about animals. and to speak about animals that they would have never dared to tackle or that they could not have seen. One of those etiologists, we have a book about the concept through which we describe animals' memory, intelligence, language. One of the scientists finishes by quoting Dubuffet, a painter, a beautiful quote from Dubuffet that explains how you have to look at the world and how he, as a painter, perceives the world. This scientist, who is part of my team, can be free enough to do that. And Dubuffet, a painter, is opening his eyes, allowing him to look at animals differently. If he had stayed within his discipline, he would have lost a whole richness.
So there are a number of threads there that excite me tremendously that come together. Actually, I'm going to have a question for both of you, and I'll start with Marta, based on a number of the things you just said, Professor Baratay. To begin with, the idea of changing how we see animals, how we tell their stories. In some ways, as you're describing, you sound fairly unique actually within your discipline, that the rigidity is in some ways the default because it's adults, and adults are rigid and locked into their way of thinking in many cases in a way that I find the most intelligent readers on the planet, the most intelligent viewers on the planet aren't. And those are children. And you mentioned, I'm fascinated about the use of typography to convey action, to convey language, and using typography because with languages that don't have the advantage of being having ideograms. And the idea of, so basically my question is, and I'll start with Marta, do you notice children when children are going into your exhibition, at the festival, or I'm actually curious if you've done workshops with children where you have somebody who actually is like, here's somebody that could end up thinking differently from the adults who are locked into their way of thinking. What have your experiences been with children and this material? And just how do you see sort of the potential for this material with children? And then after you, I'm actually going to ask a similar question to Professor Baratay.
Sadly, actually, I didn't do any workshops with children until now. So I've seen like a few of them coming to the exhibition, but I haven't really had time to be honest, to kind of observe what they would do or how they reacted. We would have to, I know that your daughter was very in the process of us making the book. So that would be maybe interesting from if you told us about how she reacted to the material. Because she was like coming to our conversations at some points and being there, and you told me that she was informed of all the stories and everything that was happening, and she saw the images. So no, I don't really have that experience yet, but that's something maybe to consider and to think about. I only did workshops with adults, like young adults, students, so they were already in the academy, let's say. So they were already in their studies, corrupted, yeah. Yes, and unfortunately they didn't have the same perspective. So no, I don't know. I mean, not much to say about that from my side.
Well, so I'm curious, Professor Baratay, because as you're describing this, it's almost sort of like concrete poetry, the use of typography, but there's also an element, it brings to mind some of my favorite children's picture books, both as a parent, but just as somebody who loves books and art. And I was curious, you've written and collaborated on many books. Have you ever done my question is if you've ever done a book sort of for children or ever been tempted to? And also sort of if you were having this conversation we're having with children, when you talk to children about this, and you can bring a radically different perspective from most adults, do you feel like a sense of responsibility, but also sort of an excitement to have somebody who doesn't have all these anthropocentric preconceptions necessarily?
Je pense que les enfants, ils ont
Well, I think that the advantage of children on us is that they still know, well, it depends of their age, of course, but they can in fact combine emotions, the corporal approach, the intellectual approach, while of course all the studies at school or the university afterwards are in fact encouraging us to dissociate those two elements. That's the heritage of this huge cat performed in the 17th or 18th century, when there was a big difference put in place between being reasonable and emotions, the corporal things, etc. So children have developed this interest. So I have not made any books for children, but I know, for instance, that the last book on cats, as my colleagues have said, they told me that they have read that with children, and in fact there are some expressions that the children knew perfectly. For instance, launching your legs, or turning your ear on something, or this sensing something with your nose, or those games, wordplay. 2 or 3 colleagues told me that their children understood it perfectly, even though, of course, that from my colleagues, the reaction was rather, well, does it really make sense? That's what they thought. And that's what I can see when I'm looking at the scientific world for the time being. They're not really going for it. I think that is going to change. So this reticence is going to change. But when writing the animal biographies about the corrida of Islero, and I have written it in a particular way, putting the animal in the first plan and humans in the background. So there are many readers and journalists, for instance, in the media, who told me that I have felt like the bull. So thanks to what you have written, I was feeling with the animal. Well, maybe not replacing it, but being with it. So getting out of my own condition. So this is quite important. Concerning children, I think that we should explore this kind of things. Frankly, I have not made it yet, even though I am currently cooperating with a French team who is going to publish a series of animal biographies for television. So in this series of animal biographies, we'll have a giraffe or 1827 who arrived in Paris through the Mediterranean, and there were also pigeons traveling during the war, etc. So they're going to mix up archives of that time and animation, 3D animation, etc., because they would precisely like to make of it something that would fit to all ages, to all audiences. So they feel that they should use various ways of expression in order to get the interest of the whole population. So a 3D animation is not something I have thought of. So a kind of a cartoon, for instance, for the giraffe, who is starting his journey in Marseille, and then it arrives at Aix-en-Provence, which is a small town. It's a little bit like Krakow, which is a great city because, well, it was preserved and it's a magnificent city. I've been there once. So if you look at Aix-en-Provence at the time, it was just a small town. So people from Aix-en-Provence, when the giraffe went in there, they were there in the streets, but they were also up at the windows looking at it. So people have never seen a giraffe at the time before. So it was like having a Martian walking in our streets today. So people were looking at it, crying and shouting, and it was at the level of the head of the giraffe. And we know that there's nothing more emotional, more difficult for a giraffe to have such shouting at the level of its head. When there's a predator attacking a giraffe, it's in fact at the level of its neck when it starts drinking. So they're very sensitive to that, and we don't have any pictures of the time. So recreating it, as I have told them, recreating this entrance of the giraffe with the shouting all around. Well, today we have means of animation which could make it possible, and probably they will, to go a little bit farther to see what the animal perceived at that time. Those are things that we did not have several years ago, and it's really something passionate to work with them. There are people of the cinema, they have already contacted an animation team from Japan, etc., etc. So I'm very happy to work with them. Well, I will be their scientific counselor, but I think that they're going to inspire me to write other books in a different way.
Okay. I think I feel in some ways that this discussion is sort of like Marta's book in that it's 850 pages, this book, and yet it's sort of just the beginning. It's volume 1, Marta, right? And so I feel like our discussion actually could continue. We are going to wrap up for now. I want to thank Professor Éric Baratay for so many thoughts that I am going to be working on for days, weeks, months to come, perhaps in some ways forever, related to practice and interdisciplinary practice. And thank you, Marta Bogdańska, or Marta, because Marta is a very close friend and collaborator. Thank you too for sort of coming together, both like in spirit, but also the influence between and the respect that you two have for each other within the context of a project like Shifters. And thanks to everybody watching at home out there. So, okay, I don't know what time anyone will see this.
Si je peux dire un tout petit quelque chose.
If I may say something,
of course.
It's a book which is very easy to read, and the images, well, they make you travel, and in fact you don't feel that it's 850 pages. Don't try to scare the readers. So in fact the pictures are just taking you on this journey.
I want to say that I'm super grateful, and it was so mind-opening, this talk. I feel like we should have another one sometime, maybe in a few months. And you will not believe it, but the fly is still here and it's still listening. I think it's like mesmerized by this talk. So let's see. Anyways, thank you so much. And yeah, hope you will enjoy this talk.
Okay, take care now. Bye.
Merci. Au revoir.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, I guess that's
yeah, okay, I guess we can stop. They will record until the end because they said they will. Okay,
they've just stopped language interpretation, so this is no longer being interpreted. Thank you so much. We are indeed recording automatically until the very end, but the technical stuff at both ends will be cut before it's broadcast.
Voilà, on enregistre jusqu'au bout, mais cette partie technique ne sera pas publiée par la suite.
D'accord.
And we're gonna let you know, Professor Baratay, when we will publish everything.